More than 100 countries and thousands of delegates descend on St. Petersburg, Russia for an important economic forum. And in another development we're following, Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with Microsoft's Bill Gates in Beijing. Hello, I'm Einar, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping held talks with tech billionaire Bill Gates in Beijing on Friday. President Xi and Gates discussed strengthening cooperation between the Gates Foundation and Beijing to accelerate innovation and development. Meanwhile, the 26th St. Petersburg International Economic Forum has come to a close. This year's theme focused on Russia's economic sovereignty and the future of the global economy. CGTN's Alyosa Milenkovic reports from St. Petersburg.
A very busy Friday at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Everyone intended to finish whatever they had to do and take a seat before the big event. As always, the day of the plenary session is the day here at the St. Petersburg Forum. A traditional address by the Russian President Vladimir Putin is scheduled, along with the announcement of his guest, which is always revealed at the last minute. This year was no different. At the stage next to his host, it was Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune. He arrived in Russia a day earlier for high-level talks on topics that included the global natural gas market. But the star of the plenary session was the Russian leader, who started his address by applauding the Russian economy.
Today, dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, we can state with confidence the strategy we chose last year by both the Russian state and business has worked. In April of last year, Russia's gross domestic product grew by 3.3% in annual terms, and by the end of the year, it will add more than 1%.
In an almost 80-minute keynote speech, Vladimir Putin focused mostly on Russia's economy and the direction for its development. He announced expansion of the Asia to Europe rail corridor, as well as the Northern Sea route. Working with Iran on the north to south corridor is among his top priorities. Yet, his most anticipated comments were on the current Ukraine crisis. He addressed the possible consequences of Ukraine getting Western fighter jets.
And if they are based abroad but used in fighting, we'll see how to hit them and where we can hit those that are used against us in fighting. This is a serious danger of further drawing NATO into this military conflict.
And while Ukraine is claiming to make new gains on the battlefield, the Russian president described a very different reality, saying Kiev's counteroffensive has so far been unsuccessful and that Russia is not even using its full might. He once again rejected the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons, but at the same time confirmed that Moscow has delivered the first batch of tactical nuclear warheads to Belarus. Alyosa Milenkovic, CGTN, St. Petersburg.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. We have Sourabh Gupta. He is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Brazil, we're joined by Gustavo Ribeiro. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Brazilian Report. And here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyoshin is a professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you. Anton, as I said, there are thousands of delegates from more than 100 countries in St. Petersburg for this forum, although the New York Times says there is, quote, scant international presence at the forum. But if we look at what's happening right now, the forum is taking place at a time when the conflict rather in Ukraine continues to rage on. There's still massive sanctions against Russia. So what will Russia be hoping to get out of this conference, not just in terms of concrete agreements, but also in terms of the optics?
I think that the quote that you used from the New York Times, which, by the way, is also something that jumped out at me today, is already helping the Russians with optics without their even trying to do anything, because it seems that for the journalist who wrote that article, international means Western, exclusive, with a few of the security dependencies in the Pacific region. The rest of the world, with more than 3/4 of the planet's population, seems not to calculate as part of the international community. I listened to President Putin's speech today. It was unusually long, by the way, as Ayos's report mentioned correctly. But what struck me is that there was not a single reference to Ukraine in the speech. All the references to the conflict in Ukraine came during the Q&A after the speech. And this decision to focus on A, the Russian economy, which was the crux of the speech, but B, also the global economy, I think speaks a lot to the narrative that is coming out of Moscow, which is that Moscow does not assume that NATO's right to expand into Ukraine is the most important thing on every government's list of priorities all over the world, and that economic relations are actually the most important thing. And that already is a profound difference from what we're hearing coming out of the Western capitals and from Western diplomats and leaders who visit Africa, South America, Asia, where it's all about Ukraine. Putin made it very clear today that what he called the deformed neo-colonial economic model, the Western-centered era of globalization is coming to an end, that a multipolar era of economic integration is coming to replace it, that these changes, as he put it, are permanent and irreversible. And he was essentially speaking to the global South, to the majority of the world's population, and asking them to make a claim, to play a role in formulating the rules by which the geo-economic game is played in the world. And that's why so many non-Western countries were represented at the forum. I see it as one of the data points that all tend towards the de-dollarization, the de-Westernization, the recalibration of global geopolitics and geoeconomics, even more importantly.
Right, Anton, just briefly, as you point out, the focus was on trade, on global economics, but in those references he did make to the conflict in Ukraine, he talked about the Western countries using fighter jets against Russia, and said that, you know, it runs the risk of drawing NATO into this conflict. He also talked about the deployment of nuclear warheads in Belarus as well. What did you make of that?
Well, the question is here, this is a tactical question, Anand. If the planes that NATO provides are used from Ukrainian runways, are flown by Ukrainian pilots, then the Russians will target them as they do Soviet-made planes that the Ukrainian Air Force has been using. I think he's referring also, however, to the fact that if, in the absence of trained Ukrainian pilots, and it's important to remind our viewers that learning to fly an F-16 and being able to fly it well in situations of extreme stress, such as during combat, takes not months but years of training. The idea that a Ukrainian pilot can be trained within 1, 2, or even 3 months to actually fly an F-16 effectively is a myth, as any military specialist will tell you. This is why the Russians seem to suspect that some of the pilots, at least in the early F-16 missions, whenever those aircraft will get there, and by the way, we're not certain about that either, but if those pilots are professional members of NATO militaries and they're shot down, this will be a problem. If those airplanes take off from NATO fields and enter Ukraine, those fields may become targets for retaliatory Russian strikes. And yes, in that case, things may get out of hand very quickly. I think Putin is sort of laying out the range of possibilities, the minefield of risks, as the West is seriously considering supplying the F-16s. Although, again, let me emphasize that so far, we don't actually know where they're going to come from and how many and when.
Okay. All right, Einar Tangen, let's move back to the forum. Of course, this was a showcase of Asian markets at this year's forum. China is Russia's biggest trading partner, accounting for almost 1/3 of Russian exports. China is also China's biggest oil supplier. How vital is this trade relationship, and how do you see it growing in the face of what we've seen over the past few months?
Well, China is leading the pack, as you pointed out, but it's purely economic. There's no support for the war or any kind of weapons. It's very important because, as was said earlier, this is about showing that there is a other structure in the world, and it's based around the global South, who are not, who showed up in droves. And you can see the physical forum, the number of people there. And this is something where Putin has, in essence, said, look, the West tried their best to do away with the economy, and it has not happened. China's a big component of that, but so is India. So is all of these other countries who've been willing to buy oil or trade with Russia, also the de-dollarization. So, Putin, in essence, has his wish to a certain extent. He talked about the Munich Security Forum many years ago that he rejected a U.S. world order. It wasn't about necessarily choosing sides at that time. He just said that they had been lied to. The territories that were not supposed to be part of NATO had already been taken in, and this is many years ago, and it's gotten worse since then. So the U.S. sanctions haven't worked according to what he's laid out, and obviously the ruble is still alive, and so is the Russian economy. And China is not supporting Russia in this war. What they're doing is supporting a structure that is outside this kind of binary, you're either for the U.S. or not.
Sourabh Gupta, Russia invited the United Arab Emirates as the guest of honor at this year's forum. Last year it was Egypt, the year before that it was Qatar, all key U.S. allies. What does this tell us about the changing, evolving international alignments that we're seeing?
The Middle East actually is a very interesting place at this point of time, because with the change in this administration, there has really been a falling out with many of the Middle East states with the United States. I mean, I'm talking the Middle East allies, particularly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others. And many of them, as you know, have volunteered to sign on to join the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Some of them want to be in the BRICS arrangement also. So they understand the shifting balance of power. They're not detained by nuances, but some particular Western nuances which the U.S. wants to install and the West wants to install. There's a rules-based order, a UN-centered rules-based order, and then there's American rules and an American order. And they play by the UN-centered rules-based order. They're happy to be tightly knit with the U.S. because they have security considerations to take care of, particularly with regard to Iran. But we've seen there's been significant movement in these relations, in these bilateral relationships regionally, once the U.S. has stayed back or has been moved away from that relationship. And frankly, the question then arises: is the U.S. becoming is U.S. relations impacting other countries in certain ways that it actually does not allow their relationships to flower because the U.S. is present out there? Because once the U.S. gets somewhat marginalized, these countries obviously can work together and work together fruitfully and productively. And that's a lesson to bear for the Indo-Pacific region, where the U.S. has now come gung-ho and is trying to deepen its alliances and partnerships. So I think the Middle East is a very important and useful template of how power is shifting in the international system.
And how significant is it, Sourabh, at a time when the United States is doing its utmost to isolate Russia?
It's significant, but these countries are going to do it on the basis of their national interests, and they are speaking clearly and loudly that. I mean, loudly. I mean, when I say loudly, I mean they're making the view very firmly stated that we know where our national interests are. Don't dictate that to us. And however flowery the language of the internet Western-led international system might be, we know where power is shifting to, and we will go. We know which side the bread is buttered, and we will make the necessary choices. And I think it's just very plainly being said by someone as close and as integrated in the international system as folks like the Saudis and the UAE are.
Gustavo, Russia also invited the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, but he's not there. Any reason he's not there? In fact, none of the BRICS heads of state are at this forum.
Well, there are many reasons for Lula not being there. One is the fact that he has a lot on his plate in terms of international politics, national politics, I'm sorry. He has been having problems with building his coalition in Congress, and it is a moment of tension within his coalitions. He will have to pull one of his cabinet ministers to accommodate some interests from Congress, so it's not necessarily the best time to be leaving, especially because next week he's already visiting France and the Vatican. But there's also the fact that Lula is trying not to seem too aligned with Russia, especially on the issue of the war in Ukraine, because he has made several statements that have vexed traditional Western allies from Brazil, especially the U.S. and Europe, blaming NATO and the U.S. for prolonging the war, suggesting that Ukraine should surrender part of its territory to Russia in order to just end the conflict at whatever cost. And Lula in recent weeks, he has tried to be more ambivalent and try to modulate his rhetoric on the war in Ukraine, depending on who he's talking to. So we had the top EU official earlier this week in Brazil. We had the Finnish president a few weeks ago, and he has moderated a lot his rhetoric, saying that he defends the integrity of the Ukrainian territory and that he condemns the invasion of Ukraine. So going to Russia at this moment would send some mixed messages, especially because one of his top foreign policy priorities is getting the Mercosur-EU deal done. Brazil, as the biggest economy in Mercosur, certainly leads the way in those negotiations. So going to talk to Emmanuel Macron next week and right after visiting Putin would not necessarily be the best look for his aims.
Anton, President Putin also estimated that the Russian economy will see growth of between 1.5 and 2%. That is not quite what the BBC told us. It quoted Western leaders as saying that the Russian economy will collapse. But given what President Putin has now said, what does that tell us about the resilience of the Russian economy at a time when it's facing the sanctions that have been imposed on it?
You know, I got a sense from both Putin's speech. I also saw a couple of panels today in the closing day of the forum. And I have to tell you that the overall impression that I got was of a feeling of optimism amidst a very difficult situation. The Russians are, of course, especially members of the government who are in charge of economic issues. They are certainly not ignorant or delusional about the difficulties that the Russian economy has faced. But compared to last year's economic events and discussions, this year's forum was notably more upbeat. Putin himself, of course, sounded almost like he was taking a victory lap because of how well the Russian economy has withstood the sanctions, given the severity of them. And by the way, no country in the history of our species has faced anything like what the Russians have faced. The fact that the economy only shrank by 2% last year, or just over 2%, is nothing short of a miracle. I don't know how much it will grow exactly. The Russian government, by the way, has been fairly accurate about its predictions. Its traditional position is to under-predict performance and then to raise the percentages of growth as the year goes on. We have the IMF figures, which also predict a growth of the Russian economy, except less than what Putin mentioned today. As for Western leaders, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't put too much trust into what they said. These are mostly folks who thought that the Russian economy was going to implode a year ago. There will be a 20% contraction and basically a collapse. We know for a fact that that has not happened. Is the situation easy? No, it isn't. But with the help of the non-Western world, the Russians have weathered this storm. And this is a very powerful signal to the rest of the planet, which is that you can withstand Western pressure, even when it's concentrated on you alone.
Einar, we've been hearing for a long time that the rest of the world would like to reduce its dependence on the United States dollar as a reserve currency. Here is what Alexander Vedyakin of Sberbank, which is Russia's biggest financial institution, this is what he had to say about that. Let's listen.
Yuan has already beaten euro and US dollars on the Moscow's currency exchange. That's the must tradable, so to say, currency in Russia. Yuan is a currency. Now is a currency of choice for Russian people when this person or the people would like to have some savings in a foreign currency. Yuan, not USD, not euro.
So listening to that, Einar, I mean, how significant a shift is it?
Well, I don't think that that's the true measure of de-dollarization. I mean, Russia obviously can't use dollars or euros very effectively. They're prevented from doing so because they couldn't move them through the banks. Chinese currency is obviously it's stable. They're doing a lot of trade, as you in the figures you mentioned earlier. 1/3 of their export business is with China. I mean, international trade. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense that the U.S., but I wouldn't equate using yuan with de-dollarization. The issue with de-dollarization, it's coming, but it's not going to wipe out the U.S. dollar, and it certainly cannot come in like a light switch. This secure transactions between banks at huge volumes has to be worked out. It involves having secure lines and things like this, and the physical apparatus isn't there. But clearly, central banks from around the world, even in Israel, are moving away from the dollar in terms of exposure. There are real concerns about the fact that the U.S. refuses to deal with its debt problem. It keeps kicking it down the road. But if this wasn't the U.S., many countries would be saying, well, it's a Ponzi scheme. They're borrowing money to pay the interest on money they borrowed. At some point, this has to end. So until that does, you're going to see people, looking sideways at the dollar and trying to say, look, we have to look for other to manage our risks versus something that could be untoward happening in the U.S. economy.
Sourabh, the Algerian president, Abdelmadjid Tebboune, is not only attending the forum, he's also on a state visit to Russia. He held a bilateral meeting with President Putin. They signed an expanded strategic partnership. In fact, there was a newspaper that speculated in Russia that Algeria could become what it called Russia's North African outpost and a key partner in the global gas market. How significant is this relationship in terms of Russia's outreach to that region?
Oh, I think it's important. It's very significant. Russia has had this outreach for some time now, particularly with energy producers, and the focus now is on natural gas producers, because even we go ahead with the various environmental, the UNFCCC and the COP process. Natural gas will remain an important feed source for quite a long time to come. So natural gas is not going away anywhere. And this is also, the Russians have had foresight in this regard and have done their politics right. think coming back to even that previous question with regard to the UAE and now, of course, with regard to Algeria, think of that one country and that one leader who actually has the best ties with, which cuts across, say, Jew and Arab, Shia and Sunni, Persian and Arab. Who is that? That's actually President Putin. He's right there in the center in all these relationships. And this was even at a time when the US allies had tight relationships. I'm talking the Trump administration, where the Gulf monarchies had very, very tight relations with the United States. But Mr. Putin has done his spade work out here and positioned himself in the center. And so while, of course, there are larger political gains to be accrued out there in that process, and we are seeing him encashing that capital that he invested in these countries, I think he's also has thought through in terms of energy supplies, energy dependence, energy diversification, and the role of existing energy sources and how that will play in. So I think it's fair. It's important. He's obviously had a very active North Africa strategy, but in the Middle East and North Africa, I think Putin has made important strides in energy and beyond, as a result of which Russia is central to many of the decisions that they make today.
Gustavo, there have also been discussions on a visa-free regime between Russia and Latin American countries. So far, 27 of 33 countries involved in these discussions have signed on. How does that change the relationship?
Well, it facilitates travel, it facilitates business travel. And it's interesting because Brazil is doing the exact opposite with some Western countries. During President Jair Bolsonaro's term, Brazil lifted visa requirements from the US, Canada, Japan, and Australia. And President Lula has now voided that measure, and starting in October, actually Brazil will impose more barriers from these countries. So it is interesting to see how we are seeing this movement. Yes, no, please go.
Okay. I just want to get to this final point with Einar Tangen. Einar, as I said, the one other development is the fact that Microsoft chief Bill Gates met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. 2 weeks ago, we had Elon Musk of Tesla meeting with the Chinese Minister of Commerce. We've also had Apple's Tim Cook, who's been in China. He was there in March. And despite all this anti-China rhetoric that we hear in the United States from US politicians as well as from the US media, what does this tell us?
Well, it tells you quite simply that the target for China in terms of the charm offensive is the civilization initiative. What they want to do is tell China's story person to person. For 45 years, China has had a miracle run where the U.S. has not done as well. The fact that you can walk Beijing streets without fear of being shot, that real incomes are increasing versus decreasing in the U.S. This is very important. But also, there's a disconnect between the elite power factions in many of the leading Western nations and what is happening with the business community. They're definitely in favor of more trade.
Right. We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.